Welcome to the Bioinformatics CRO podcast. I'm Grant Belgard, and I'm here with Ben Logsdon. Ben, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Grant. Thanks for having me on the show today. I'm a computational biologist. I've been in the field of computational biology professionally, I guess, for about 6+ years now. And before that, did the whole couple postdocs and, grad school in upstate New York.
Great, thanks. So tell us more about your path. What made Ben Ben? You start from the beginning.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. So I was in college, in undergrad, I was really into genetics and biochemistry, and I ended up getting a BS in biochemistry, but also minored in mathematics. So I've always kind of been like, have multidisciplinary interests. I've definitely pursued both of those going, throughout my sort of trajectory, both professionally and personally. I then went on to Cornell and got a PhD in computational biology, really focused on building new sort of machine learning and high dimensional statistical methodologies to analyze genome-wide association studies and high dimensional gene expression data sets. And really the driving purpose behind all of it was just this, wanting to understand these complicated systems, that in like physics, right? There's these simple rules, and humans have spent hundreds of years building better instruments to figure out what those rules are and try to understand them. But biology is just it's the frontier, man. We still don't know the rules. I mean, we have ideas about pieces and parts of it, but I've always been fascinated by that. And so being able to, and it's like one of those places where, a lot of biology that's being done right now or has been done has, not really focused on the sort of more quantitative side of things up until I would say relatively recently. And there's a lot of really good work you can do just at the bench doing westerns and gels and all that good stuff. That's been really powerful to help us understand and disentangle some of these systems. But I've always sort of been in the opinion that like to understand these things, you need a bigger tool set. So that was kind of the motivation to do more quantitative stuff at Cornell and get better chops on the stats and machine learning side. And then after that, I went to the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, did a postdoc there with Charles Kuperberg, looking more at like genetic epidemiology, sort of like method development for analysis of whole exome sequencing and rare variant analysis type work. And then decided I wanted to do something a little bit with potentially more translational impact, and did a second postdoc at University of Washington focused on applying these sparse model building methods to gene expression data sets in cancer to try to come up with alternative ways of identifying driver genes that, wasn't just based on mutations, but trying to use, expression signatures or detecting within expression data signatures of drivers. But then I guess the real sort of like thing that I'm passionate about now and really have been grateful for. I just left Sage Bionetworks, and I spent 6.5 years there working in the neurodegenerative research space. And that's just been an amazing experience. And as a computational biologist, oftentimes you kind of are like a hired gun, some principal investigator, or, in CRO land, especially some client like brings you in and is like, hey, I've got some data, help me make sense of it. But I do think I'm not just interested in like doing data analysis. Like I think in the context of Alzheimer's disease in particular, like I really want to understand the biology as well and really want to help sort of marry all of these different quantitative techniques with the right data sets to sort of inspire the right questions that, then the folks doing the bench work can then go track down, develop new assays, do the right experiments, so we can actually like start figuring out these diseases. Because it's also been fascinating in the Alzheimer's disease space how the field has been very married to a very small set of hypotheses about like what is driving this disease. And just looking at some of the data analysis of the omic data coming out of Alzheimer's, it's like it's not that simple. Like amyloid and tau, like the signatures are there, and there's really interesting results or insights to be gleaned from that, but there's so much other biology that's going on, and it's very complicated.
We're looking under the streetlights, right?
Yeah, I mean, the street lamp effect is real, and we could talk a lot about like misalignment of incentives in academia and industry, and why that leads to lack of diverse portfolios in terms of risk, as well as also like the technology needed to like generate data to be able to even like articulate some of the new hypotheses. You think about like for a long period of time, it's just people looking at tissue slides under a microscope and seeing, okay, well, we see these amyloid plaques and these neurofibrillary tangles. What's going on there, right? And then like omics just opens up a whole new frontier of possibilities in terms of the biology and the molecular causes of the disease. And you can't see it, right, under a microscope necessarily, unless you like know what gene you want to look at, right? And really, I think a lot of it is knowing what the players on the chessboard really are and what the rules of engagement for those players are and how it relates to what we already know. And the thing with Alzheimer's disease that makes it very different than cancer, for example, is in Alzheimer's, you can't profile the tissue during the course of the disease. You can't get antemortem tissue samples. And so all you see is what's happened at the postmortem. And so it really is like a Sherlock Holmes mystery in some sense. You know what happened after the fact, but then you're trying to like put the pieces together as to, what were the sequence of events that led to that. I think that makes it makes it a very different type of problem than I think cancer. In some sense, it's a lot harder because you're having to do a lot more inference. And we don't have good model systems. There's plenty of mouse models where you can just crank the amyloid to 11 and yeah, like things change. But if you cure Alzheimer's in a 5x fad mouse, it doesn't mean it's going to, that whatever that drug is going to work in phase 3 human trials. So yeah, so I think, I guess in terms of the answer, to wrap up the answer to your question about my sort of arc, I think it's really been really sort of generally curious and expansive in my interests, wanting to understand biology and, the sort of quantitative mathematics statistical side, but really sort of getting it, really gaining a passion for their application to neurodegenerative diseases in the last 6 years. And at Sage, I've been working in these amazing National Institute of Aging funded consortia. So the Accelerating Medicine Partnership in Alzheimer's disease, the Model AD Consortium, and most recently I was in the Treat AD Consortium. And these are multi-million-dollar, multi-institutional, open science consortia that are trying to pull back the curtain on other causes of the disease through new data generation and analysis of that data. And so like AMP-AD was focused on generating data to do systems biology analyses like WGCNA or causal network analysis, those sort of things, on gene expression from postmortem brain to prioritize new targets in disease. Model AD is building 50 new mouse models of late onset Alzheimer's disease. And Treat AD was sort of like the open drug discovery idea, where we actually would have, medicinal chemists, structural biologists, people who had experience in developing high throughput screens and assays, and then marry that to everything upstream, right? It's just been an amazing experience working with so many different types of people. I think it's, in terms of their roles, like I think that's not something you would not generally get to experience as much in academia. Like as a bioinformatics expert, you generally have the PI who has some biological question and you're asked to analyze some data. And in this case, there was just a lot of different perspectives and language, how people talk about things. And so it's been great. Like it's been, it was a really amazing experience and definitely opened my eyes to like, how complicated, doing all these processes are. Sort of like from a philosophy of science side of things, like all of this is open science. So everything was being put out in the open through the AD Knowledge Portal that's hosted at Sage. And I think that's also something that the young guard, I think, is recognizing how important as we go forward is that like the actual value of any individual data set is usually, unless you're talking like, clinical trial data, obviously, but like, preclinical, like basic research, like the value of any of those data sets is actually pretty minimal on their own. And it's only when you can start combining them and like layering things up that you can really sort of realize their potential. But a lot of people just sort of, in terms of incentives, they're like, well, I'm going to like generate this data and then, sit on in my lab and have some postdoc crank on it for 2 years until they can, hopefully find some gold and get a, Nature Science or Cell paper, right?
So following on the misalignments of incentives, what do you think are the strongest misalignments, and what do you think might be some reasonable reforms that should be considered to mitigate them?
I mean, I think like a lot of it has to do with the academic promotion that basically people who are looking to get tenure, they're being judged on like two highly related criteria. Actually, really one criteria, which is how much indirects are they bringing to their institution, which is a function of how many successful like R-level grants are they applying for and getting. And that's all predicated then on like how many publications they're putting out, because publications are kind of the raw material to sort of demonstrate, leadership in a particular field or domain. I do think that, in terms of the misalignment of incentives, I mean, the problem with that is that it sort of leads to a model where people they're trying to be like an expert in one narrow thing. And some of these problems, the scale of the problem, it's not something that you can do if you just have one hat. And so then it makes it much more difficult for, I think, the traditional R kind of award, where like you have the academic who has a lab that's like cranking out postdocs and grad students who are all sort of working on that one little like that tiny little bubble on the edge of human knowledge that they're trying to expand. It'd be interesting. I'm less familiar with the physics, in actual experience with like how it works in the world of like particle physics, but in that case, there are papers with like 10,000 authors on them, and the instruments are just so big and expensive that like in some sense they have to work together with lots of people with different expertise in a lot more coordinated fashion, just because the scale of the problem is, just so big and complicated. But in science, I think it's still a little, I mean, in biomedical research, it's still a little bit of Wild West, where like having an academic research lab is kind of having like your own little company, right? Where you're like trying to put in competitive bids to the federal government on research proposals, and you're trying to demonstrate that you can be out, in front and push the boundary on human knowledge, in a very specific way. But I think those incentives lead more towards putting out lots of papers and being able to secure lots of indirect dollars to your parent institution. And that, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be like taking risks. You're going to want to like continue to keep, your lab being funded, right? And I think one of the challenges is for some of these areas of biology where we don't really understand what's going on, and we have a lot of the street lamp effect, as a community, we need to take more risks, and we need to spread that risk around to a much broader pool of people working on these problems. We need like a leaderboard of hypotheses, right? And like have people cranking away on all of them. And that as a society, we're like investing sort of proportionately across them, right? It's not tenable. You can't ask an early stage academic investigator to be like, oh, you should go after this target that nobody knows anything about. It's like there's 10 papers in PubMed on it. They're going to be like, no, I'm going to go after the one where like, we have a lot of prior evidence and we can like write a sweet R01, right? Yeah. So I think that's one big misalignment of incentives, where for people who want to get tenure, they're, both in terms of the review process for grants, but also in terms of, how they're being assessed. There's a general sort of necessary conservatism. And, maybe that's fine. Maybe like in academia, that can just be how it works. But then there does need to be some other outfits that can contribute to our sort of collective knowledge and take some of those risks and push the boundaries a little bit more. And that, a lot of that has to do with like how, academic organizations organize themselves, right? They've decided that they have this concept of tenure and that's the like big carrot they have for all these early stage investigators. It's interesting because I think like once you get to someone who's a later stage investigator who has like already, made their name and, have less to lose, they're actually more likely to take some of these risks and go after like projects and ideas that are a little bit more on the frontier or a little bit more on the boundary. But
Well, and they can certainly afford to do so, right? They typically have larger labs. They may have HHMI funding or something like this. And the failures don't really count against you. And the productivity per dollar, I don't think, counts against you that much if you're still publishing high profile, interesting papers. And so, I mean, what I've seen from a lot of labs like that is they'll put postdocs and grad students on fairly risky, high risk, high reward projects, which are great when they work out. And I mean, that kind of stuff is pretty important to move science forward. But it doesn't necessarily always serve the postdocs well who may have been put on an unsuccessful project, given the rest of the system that's currently in place. So if Francis Collins is, who knows why, listening to this podcast as he's driving into Bethesda, what would be your message for him?
Oh man. Put on the hot seat. Yeah, I mean, I think like the way in which the labor market works in academia should be completely rethought. Like, I think that postdocs are incredibly, like on average, like undercompensated given their level of training, and that you look at fields where there are good industry opportunities, like I'd say more in the sort of machine learning area or like EE or CS, and you see this just brain drain from academia, that's a problem. I think for me personally, it's like super frustrating that the biggest problems of our time, curing Alzheimer's disease or cancer or all these other sort of like huge biomedical research problems, you still have like a huge brain drain of folks, with the quantitative side of skills. They're all going out to Amazon or Facebook or Google or whatever, right? Like, because the sort of financial compensation is just, it's just not comparable, right? Like, they're like, why would you do a postdoc when you could get a six-figure salary, like, or more, right? And then in general, like, postdocs, I think, you can end up having folks be taken advantage of because the actual like academic job market is so like absurdly expensive or absurdly competitive, and people just get stuck, like in a perma postdoc where they're just sort of in a lab and like it's comfortable and there isn't a lot of good opportunities to like progress professionally, and so people will stay in postdocs for 7 to 8 years. So I think, if I was talking to Francis, I'd say like, hey, look, there needs to be a complete sort of rethinking of the training model to like address the problems that we have now. The old model doesn't work. Like, you don't have this model where you can just have people come in as grad students, get their PhD, go do a postdoc with the one expert in the field, have their own ideas, and then, get that first R01 or, do a K award or whatever, and then go off and start their own lab, right? I just don't think it's going to work like that going forward if we're actually going to make progress on some of these problems, because you need to be able to assemble teams of people with complementary expertise who can work together well as a team. That's just not something you're trained for in the academic model necessarily, right? It's very much so like you have to like figure out where you're going to like, have the insight, the lone genius in the tower, right? Who's going to like figure it all out. Really thinking how to restructure the training model. And I think that comes like at the end of the day, it comes down to the funders, because the PIs are the ones that are applying for grants, and those grants are being used to like pay the postdoc or grad students salary and whatever. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's a little too radical of a take, but I do think it's true.
Yeah, there definitely are some bad habits we sometimes have to train people out of when they come from academia. When you do assemble teams with complementary expertise and so on, because I think there's a lot more, in general, a lot more teamwork in biotech. The incentives are set up in a very different way. Charlie Munger said, "You show me the incentives, and I'll tell you the outcome." Right. um, so, channeling Peter Thiel here, what's something you believe
Uh-oh.
is true, but where most people would disagree with you?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think we don't talk or think enough about the long view in biomedical research. I'm not sure people would disagree with me on this necessarily. I think that they would just haven't really thought about it. Have you ever read the Foundation novels by Isaac Asimov?
Yeah.
So just for people listening, in those novels, you have this sort of galactic empire that's hitting the end of its tenure basically, and about to like descend into, some like 10,000 year dark ages or something. And this guy, Harry Seldon's like, well, that sounds terrible. Let's do something about it. He creates this organization called the Foundation, and long and short of it is that, the Foundation's purpose is to marry sort of changes in policy and technology and like all of the things that make a society work, and come up with probabilistic models associated with those, and make sort of subtle changes, pushing on all the levers so that humanity doesn't go through another 10,000 year dark age, basically. And I think from my perspective, I think we think a lot about the short game, like going back to incentives in private corporation world, like or public corporations. But, in the private sector, there's a lot of focus on shareholder value, maximizing profits. And like those are fine. Like I think that having good incentives to like have people be productive and to produce goods and services that are valuable to the community is great. And for a lot of like areas in human society where there's problems that are very amenable to that solution, I think in my mind it's like, those sort of market forces are really good at finding local like maxima. But I think for the longer view problems, you need a little bit more than that. And like the only thing we have now, like for biomedical research to be specific, is the academic model where you're funding people to sort of satisfy their academic curiosity about little pieces of this bigger puzzle of, say, neurodegeneration or evolution or biology development, whatever. And I don't think it's as intentional as it could be. I think that there could be like grand projects or grand plans, and not so much like the war on cancer. Like that always kind of felt like it was more of a PR stunt to raise lots of money and awareness. These bigger projects where you're saying like here are the things we need to understand to be able to actually move the needle on this. And here's how we're going to fund this in a like very intentional way over not 3 years, but like 20, 30 plus years. And you're expecting failure and you're like building all of those things in. And it just, I don't know, it's just like as a society, we just don't talk and think like that, right? Like half of society struggles to accept climate change is real. So it's definitely an uphill battle, but like,
Well, the NIH funding is a bit of a roller coaster, right? So it's
yeah,
it's hard to make a 20-year plan when you have no idea what will be happening with the overall budget. And I mean, I do think that is a pretty controversial take, right? Certainly projects like ENCODE and Human Brain Project and things like this have gotten a lot of criticism from scientists saying the money would be better spent on R01 or internationally R01 like grants. But it is interesting the kind of long view like that. Squaring that with our system of funding is a challenge.
yeah, no, definitely. I think the biggest challenge really is it's really like the human side of things and figuring out how to like design these systems or articulate these plans in a way that works given the sort of vagaries of the personal human interest. I've worked in multiple consortia and with lots of different scientists in my time, and it's pretty amazing like the variety of ways in which things can go wrong when you're talking about collaborative exercises. And in some sense, that's why this, I can't remember who I was reading on Twitter or somewhere about there was a scientist who was talking about like how, I can't trust anyone else's data but my own, right? Like, because at least with my own data, like I know exactly how it was collected, I know it was done right. But I think like at some point we have to, because we just can't get far enough. The amount of people who are suffering so badly because of some of these diseases and the fact that we just can't work together, like that just seems like it shouldn't be the reason why we don't move the needle, right? Like, so I think that there's some aspects here of the science of science that probably needs to be brought in. Like there was an interesting paper that came out, I think it was in Nature last year, talking about how like small teams can be more disruptive if they can coalesce a new idea and like move it forward very quickly. So they're like the explorers who are going out and discovering some like completely new asteroid or something, right? But then it takes the whole community to vet that, sort of move everyone forward. In terms of how we work together as scientists, I think you need some hybrid model where you've got like these small teams that are taking these big risks, and then maybe finding some crazy new biology or whatever. But then you have to bring the whole community along, right? And I think like, there's the danger of, some of the high profile publications is there's such an incentive for people to like be the one who discovers that asteroid, right? Like I think that there was a paper that came out recently on the, this like somatic recombinants in APP, and they thought that some of them were more pathological, and they were getting reintroduced into the genome and all this crazy stuff. And there was another paper that came out and that came out in Nature a couple years ago. And then there was a paper that came out recently that was basically saying how that was probably just an artifact. And so that's like an example of where the community is doing its work, but it's on such a long time frame, right? Like, and I don't think it's a problem, like, that we make mistakes as a scientific community. Like, that's kind of the point. You're on the boundary of human knowledge. Like, it's an inherently risky enterprise. Your ideas are probably going to be wrong more than they are right. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have good mechanisms for vetting that, but also for encouraging that exploration in a productive way.
Absolutely. I mean, in my experience, it can be more difficult to get a rebuttal published. You can be in review for much longer, and the standards in some cases can be even higher than for the original paper itself. And I think part of the reason for that is there's, I think, not enough tolerance for people being wrong. And I don't mean, things like fraud. I mean, that's a totally different matter. But when people get a paper retracted or something, it can be seen as, kind of the kiss of death for the first author and a stain on the senior author and so on. And as long as it's, again, kind of an honest mistake, it's the consequences can be so severe that people will defend bad work that's wrong long after they should just engage their critics and recognize, oh yeah, this is wrong, and retract the paper with a relevant statement and move on. And to a lesser extent, that I think that happens very frequently, where there are a lot of papers out there where essentially the core conclusions of the paper are wrong, and everyone in that subfield knows that. But if you aren't in that field, you're entering that field from an adjacent field and things like this, unless you really talk with people or have a postdoc spend a year or two trying to replicate the results, you don't know. And we don't currently have, I think, a good mechanism for communicating that. Um, uh, because again, in many cases, people kind of fight the retraction and so on, so it doesn't happen.
That's partially due to the incentives, right? That it's like your stock options or something, man. Like, once you have a couple of those Nature papers, you can just like keep exercising your scientific credit options as for a long, long period of time. And I think it's a human behavioral thing. Like, there's a network effect. The rich get richer, that sort of thing. You've established yourself as, a leader in the field. So it's going to be so much easier for you to like get that R01 or whatever other funding, federal funding opportunity. And so, yeah, like when people, are wrong, they're going to fight tooth and nail because it has a very direct effect on their ability to continue to like professionally be a scientist in the current model.
And the other thing I've observed, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is sometimes the criticism is wrong and the results are solid, the methods are solid, but in many cases, other bystanders rush to conclusions. They see a criticism or a rebuttal of a paper, and without really reading it and judging it for themselves and assessing it on the merits, they take a shortcut that, okay, this is crap. And sometimes that's right, and I mean, I think sometimes it's not. Sometimes these rebuttals are, let's see, podcast appropriate language, are incorrect. And I think right now everything is very stilted, right? So there is good conversation at conferences in person, but that's not recorded. That doesn't get disseminated. There's, I think, sometimes very polarized conversation on Twitter that doesn't really get us towards the truth. How do you think we could set things up in kind of taking advantage of the internet and everything to get us closer to that in a way that is better recorded and more easily disseminated across both that subfield but also the broader community?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I know that journals will often let the authors post their own rebuttal to the rebuttal. I was trying to think of a really good example of that. I think it was oh, what's his face? The guy, David Reich at Harvard. It was like, if you read his rebuttal to the criticism, it was like a master class in how you defend yourself, right? But at some level, that it almost feels like it's a little bit more like science is becoming, some sort of, legal um enterprise where you're trying to make a case. It becomes less and less about a holistic synthesis of all of the evidence and more about debating your opponent and winning points on them in some way. So yeah, I mean, I think to answer your question, if there are ways in which it's easier to share primary data, share all of the methods that are used, and have independent, almost like an audit type process where someone who doesn't have any skin in the game, right, is an objective outside observer as much as is possible, can go in and do an assessment. I think that would be one way. So the technological side of that is you have to be able to share data and methods. And I think until we get to that point, you're always going to have this kind of back and forth, these grudges that come up between various research groups. And I think that's all a lot of noise. Like you said, Twitter, I really like it in science Twitter for seeing new science hot off the presses. That's Twitter at its best. But for actual meaningful dialogue about these things, it's just too easy for it to devolve into everywhere else on the internet. And then at that point, you're just okay, I don't know, this is a waste of my time. This, I'm not getting a lot out of this.
I mean, I've seen a lot of people essentially go quiet in the last few years or just delete their accounts altogether. I don't know what your impression is of that, but my sense is, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was a bit more of the back and forth, and now it's gotten so polarized that, you do see certainly some combative figures that are always jumping in
Oh yeah.
and fighting with each other. But a lot of people have just kind of lurk, right? And that's mostly what I do. I just look for interesting papers.
It's just too easy to say the wrong thing. And then I don't know, just reading this article in the New Yorker I'm going to be totally typecast now to your listeners. This guy loves the New Yorker. But it was in the one recently where they're talking about the COVID-19 crisis and, people getting shamed on social media and how we still don't quite understand the effect of social media. And public shaming has been how society enforces certain behaviors. But we've now created a technology that puts it on steroids. And what's the effect of that? And it's just sort of fascinating. And I think it can stifle open and frank conversation because people don't want to log in and get all this hurtful feedback from hundreds or thousands of people, right? That's just a bummer, man.
Right. I mean, it seems like the challenge is the monkey mind, and maybe tech, can't save us. Maybe it kind of amplifies it. And although the thing is, some of the same people who are just total jerks on Twitter are perfectly nice, seemingly reasonable people in person, right? I mean, I think there is a psychological element to being face to face with someone versus typing on your phone.
Yeah, the anonymization piece of it, you could talk about that in the context of peer review too. If we're just sort of hitting all the all the related topics there, I think the anonymization, there are good reasons for it in peer review. There's also probably some pretty good reasons against it.
Do you sign your reviews?
I haven't been. I might start now, especially that I'm in I'm going to a startup. I might start signing them because being in industry because your incentives are less linked to the whole academic system, there's chances for things being held against you later on.
Right. It's crazy. Some of these grudges you see. I mean, in some cases, they date from 25 years back, but it's such a small world that it does have a substantial negative impact on
It's a
people.
very small world. The number of people on study section is not that many, and it's basically last person standing, right? Who gets to the point where they get invited to study section. And so
Right, and especially where a single person can essentially sync an application. I mean, I think that's kind of a problem maybe, and how the aggregate scores are computed.
yeah, no, yeah. I mean, I think I think most people are acting in good faith in study section and, in most reviews I've received as an author. I mean, there's obviously like exceptions where like people are just kind of nasty and that's just unnecessary and we should all as a community make a strong stand against like don't be nasty in any of your reviews. Like I don't know why that's a cultural thing in science where people can be just straight up mean. Just give your thoughts and give it to them straight, but there's no reason to like tear people down.
Well, some people are just mean. I mean, I think for some people, the anonymous factor plays a role, but there's some scientists out there writing under their own name who are very openly mean, well beyond just making their scientific point, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of funny because I'm pretty sure like most of us, they were probably bullied as kids and things, but
Yeah.
somehow they some people become the bully.
Yeah, they probably internalized it and they probably aren't even consciously aware of what they're doing. Is the sad part. It's just how they're reacting to that situation given their personal history, right? So,
Yeah. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
uh, yeah, I mean, I guess a question I have for you is sort of maybe I turn the Peter Thiel question back on you. I'm just curious what your take is on that. Like, what's
Huh,
an opinion that you hold that other people would find controversial?
that's a good question because it's not actually something I've thought about, even though I asked you, right? Um, I think the chances of an existential calamity to kind of modern society are higher than most people think. I mean, I think there's a lot of fragility. We are extraordinarily dependent on the internet for so many things, and in many ways, if a lot of the kind of backbone infrastructure of our civilization were suddenly severely disrupted, if you had a very strong solar storm or something like this, I think it would be difficult for us to reorganize quickly. I mean, even this COVID stuff, right? This is like an IFR 0.5% respiratory virus, right? I mean, throughout the 19th century, we had infectious disease epidemics that were far more deadly on a regular basis, right? I mean, every several years, we'd have something like this, and of course, we've tamed that through modern medicine and with vaccination and good clean water and things like this. But something like this that no one would have really batted an eye at in the 19th century has done a lot of damage around the world. Um, not enough to end civilization as we know it or anything like this, but I mean, I do think it reflects a greater level of fragility because a lot of the ways we used to do things we don't have anymore, right? So a lot of even workplaces now increasingly are getting rid of landlines, um,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's just so many things that kind of backup systems that we've gotten rid of for the sake of efficiency that we can no longer fall back on, and I don't know, you know, specifically what that shock could be, right? I mean, it could be any number of relatively low probability things. But if you take a lot of low-ish probability things and kind of integrate over time, the
Yeah.
chances of something happening are more than negligible. So
I
yeah, that
I
would
to,
probably be it.
I was just gonna say I totally agree with that. So I don't fall into the camp that doesn't, but
Right. So maybe it's not as controversial as
well, I don't know if I'm a typical, person. I think that a lot of that has to do with incentives, like you said, efficiency. Markets are always looking for unrealized short-term
Mhm,
efficiencies, but these big scale risks that are, as Nassim Taleb would say, like these black swan
mhm.
events that under like the local risk model where your tails are like very thin and you're like, oh yeah, no, that's like that'd be like a 15 sigma event. That's not going to happen until the heat death of the universe. Well, no, our distributions, of those
Oops.
sort of events don't follow that
Right.
profile. And I think a lot of it's just like that short-term thinking and like the incentives that are like linked to that short-term thinking. Coming back to what I was saying earlier, like if you think more long-term, then you start to think like, oh yeah, no, we've got to like design our systems to be less fragile. We got to build in like redundancy, and that there's that concept of anti-fragileness, right? Where like
Mhm.
you actually have things that in the presence of perturbations become stronger. Those sorts of conversations, it's rare to hear them. Like it's not like this political, like this crazy political season. That's what you're hearing on the debates or stuff. It's
Right.
like,
Well, and that's another thing that I mean, maybe my other answer to that would be, although I think this has become a lot less controversial in the last few years, but it is just that the kind of modern democratic neoliberal order is much more fragile, and than I think most people recognize, and we kind of take it for granted. Certainly in a lot of Western countries and English speaking countries and things. I mean, we assume it will be like this indefinitely, and I mean there are already cracks, right?
yeah, not just in the U.S. either. Like it's like
Right,
everywhere.
right, and the relative freedom and prosperity and things that we've enjoyed for a number of generations here in the big view of the long view of history is very, very short. Hopefully we can keep that going for as long as possible, but I think it's far from guaranteed. And we could see things break apart in our lifetimes. I don't know. Hopefully not. um,
Gosh, I hope
but
not.
that has become a
Because
lot less controversial, I think, in the last few years.
yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I think climate change is the like that's the real X factor. I mean, even like the Defense Department was putting out a report on like climate change is going to cause all this geopolitical instability.
I mean, I think climate change is a part of it. I think it's a lot bigger than climate change, though. I think climate change certainly contributes to and accelerates a lot of the
Yeah.
habitat loss and things like this that were already occurring and have been for a very long time. And but at the end of the day, so many. I mean, actually, in our last episode, Grace was here. We actually talked a bit about ecological disaster. um, uh, but I mean, I think something like that is a more than just a possibility. It's a depending on how you define it. I mean, it's if you talk about mass extinction events, I mean that's a certitude. We're
Yeah.
kind of it's already happening in a lot of the insects and things like this on which ultimately the charismatic megafauna depend are already on their way out. It's yeah. Kind of a nervous laughter kind of situation, but I mean, people are pretty adaptable. I mean, I don't think it's not I don't think going to be the end of certainly not the end of life on Earth, and I don't think the end of humanity on Earth or anything like that. But it certainly will make things different, um, and there will probably be a lot of people wishing that their ancestors had made different decisions. But,
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. It's it's all kind of unnerving. I feel like I'd really like times to be a little less interesting, for a
right.
bit. They just seem to be getting more interesting.
Yeah, boring's not bad. Cool. So what are you doing in between Sage and the startup? I know you're not hiking the Continental Divide or something, but uh, obviously your options are limited in this time.
I know. No, I've just, it's been honestly like I've had a week off, and I'm in Bend, Oregon right now, taking a little bit of a break. Though it wasn't much of a break because I was working on the last 2.5 days finalizing the editorial changes on the most recent on my last paper out of when I was at Sage. So it's like I feel like I was kind of trolling myself, like I'm gonna have this week off to relax, and then I'm
Right.
like, oh no, I need to get these editorial changes in because it's just gonna be a pain to do that
Oh
like
yeah,
once the
you're
new
going to be
job
busy.
starts. So, but that's done now. Thankfully, I got those in yesterday. So yeah, I'm an aspiring ultra runner, so I do a lot of running. I've got a big race coming up in February next year. Hopefully, it'll happen. Obviously, who knows with COVID? It's the Black Canyon 100K down in Arizona. So I'm just trying to put all the work in so that hopefully that'll go well.
Well, and if the official race doesn't happen, you can always go to Arizona and run by yourself.
Yeah, go run for like 11 hours.
Make yourself a shirt, right?
That's right, 11 hours just in the desert. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us today, Ben. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Grant. Really appreciate being here today. It was a lot of fun chatting with you.
Awesome.